All right, welcome back to the RockStop. My name is Chris. I am honored right now to have on the phone line the legendary drive-in movie critic himself, Mr. Joe Bob Briggs. How you doing, man?
I'm great. Great to be here, Chris.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, anytime. I mean, I don't think I'll ever have a guest on this show as knowledgeable in cult and exploitation movies as you, so this is really thrilling.
Well, if you narrow down that topic enough, all of us are geniuses, right?
I guess so. So, for maybe people that aren't too familiar with why you got into reviewing like some of the more obscure movies and things like that, what made you want to start other than maybe just a love of those movies?
Well, we're talking about the early '80s, and in the early '80s, these movies, what I'm going to call affectionately exploitation movies. All right.
Uh-huh.
These weren't reviewed at all by the mainstream media, and that might be hard for people to understand today when as soon as a horror film comes out, there's 100 reviews of it the next day on the web.
Right.
But in the early '80s, a lot of these exploitation movies, including some that today are considered classics, were considered beneath the contempt of regular movie reviewers, including, even Roger Ebert. There were certain movies that he wouldn't review, and he was considered kind of a populist guy.
Uh-huh.
Janet Maslin, who was the critic of the New York Times, actually called these movies pornography and wouldn't touch them. And so there were three of us that were writing about these movies. John Waters wrote a book called Shock Value in the 70s. But the only people that were reviewing them week to week were a guy named Bill Landis, who had a fanzine called Sleazoid Express. And he went to all the theaters in Times Square, and he would review the movie and the audience. It was kind of like an all-immersive type of review. And he liked the seamy dark side of New York City. So he was reviewing the grindhouses, and then I was reviewing the drive-ins of the Deep South, where frequently the only place these movies would play, we're talking movies like The Grim Reaper, Swinging Barmaids, Truck Stop Girls. You know. They would only play at the drive-in. They wouldn't play in the indoor theaters.
Right.
And so it was the drive-ins of the South and the grindhouses of the North, and sometimes the drive-ins of the North too, but those drive-ins were seasonal. The ones in the South stayed open all year long.
Mm-hmm.
So we were reviewing these movies, and it was kind of an outlaw thing, you know. I developed an affection for the movies, and my whole rating system. I met Roger Corman. Roger Corman was the legendary producer who made probably. Roger's in his 90s now, and he still occasionally turns up as an executive producer on something. But he probably made 700 movies.
Yeah.
And I met Roger, and he's a very smart guy. And I asked him, what are the elements? What are the principal elements that you have to have in every movie? And he would tell me, and from that I developed the concept of the drive-in totals and blood, breast, and beast, the 3 B's, blood, breast, and beast. Right. If you have all three, you got to hit. And he gave me a lot of principles. He would say, ideally, Joe Bob, the exploitation film should be 78 minutes. And the reason it should be 78 minutes and not 79 minutes is that if it does go over to 79 minutes, you require 4 film cams to transport the movie around the country to its various engagements. If it's 78 minutes, it's only 3 cans, thereby reducing the cost of transport by 25%.
Wow.
He had it down to a science.
Yeah.
Which is why none of his movies ever lost money.
Yeah, that's true. He's a very smart guy. Now, you mentioned Janet Maslin, who was sort of, put her nose up to these types of movies and as you said, looked at them as pornography almost. I heard that she wanted to debate you on something, and then she backed out about, like, maybe the impact that these movies have.
Yeah, well, if you remember Ted Koppel's Nightline, she wrote a Sunday piece about, the pornography of violent, ultra-violent films. And it was not very well researched because I could have given her better examples of ultra-violent films. but she Ted Koppel wanted to have her and me on the same show, and I agreed to do the show, and then she backed out. She didn't want to be the spokesperson for censorship. And there was a period where the MPAA ratings board was really tough on sex, and they weren't tough at all on violence. And then in the early 80s, they switched, and they became very easy on nudity and very tough on violence. And the movie that turned that around was, oddly enough, was Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was responsible for the whole PG-13 thing, because they couldn't give it an R because if kids couldn't see it, it wouldn't make money.
Yeah.
And so, but they were afraid that the mothers were going to think it was too violent. And so they invented the whole PG-13 thing.
Yeah.
But as you go later into the 80s, they start giving NC-17s to stuff like Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer.
Right.
They didn't they didn't want to give it a rating at all.
Yeah.
The distributor kept cutting it and sending it back to the ratings board and saying, "Hey, if I cut this, can I get my R?" And finally, the head of the MPAA called him up and he says, "You know what the rating of this movie should be?" He says, "It should be an S for," and he says the word that you would imagine he would say, or S. That movie is rated S. That's what we think about it.
Wow.
And they said, "No, you're not going to get an R." So he just put all the stuff back in that had originally been in the movie and said, "Oh, they're not going to give me the R anyway, so I'll just take it out NC-17.
Right. And, a lot of these movies that were edited now are being released on DVD and things like that with some of those scenes that were cut back in, and what's your thoughts on that? I mean, it's you've seen it one way for many years, and then all of a sudden you see those deleted scenes.
Yeah, well, it's a case by case thing. I mean, in some cases, the movies were really damaged by attempts to get a rating. But an example is My Bloody Valentine. My Bloody Valentine came out in February of, I think, 81. John Lennon had been murdered in December, and 3 months before. And for some reason, that event at the time was being blamed on media exposure. And Jack Valenti, the head of the MPAA, thought that movies were going to be blamed for the John Lennon murder. And so he did a massive crackdown on anybody that had horror films before the board. And they said, no, everything has to come out. All the explicit, anything resembling explicit gore has to come out of the movie.
Wow, yeah.
And so they totally eviscerated that movie. Now, they couldn't have predicted, the advent of VHS and DVDs and all the things of the next few years. And so they did not save the cut footage, and they couldn't find it years later when it was time to restore the movie. So it's basically still the same version that was badly damaged by that hysteria. 6 months later, they forgot all about it. If the movie had come out 6 months later, they wouldn't have cared. They would have let it fly right through with an R rating.
It's crazy how things like that happen just at the wrong time, that it could make the whole world a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The ratings board has one purpose: maximize profit for the industry.
Yeah.
And people have to understand that that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
so if it's a time where people are really sensitive to violence, they're going to crack down on violence.
Yeah.
If it's a time where people are really sensitive to sex, they're going to crack down on sex.
Right.
They always, and they'll use those terms, sex and violence. These movies are full of sex and violence, unless they like the movie, and then they'll say romance and adventure.
Yeah, that's very true. So speaking of censorship and things like that, you started your TV show with Drive-In Theater on the Movie Channel, where it's pretty much anything goes. You could say and show the movies however they were originally put out. There's no editing for TV. And then you moved over to TNT with MonsterVision. I mean, that must have been a pretty big difference.
Yeah, although even though when I was on the Movie Channel, even though it's premium cable, so you're not subject to any kind of censorship, they still had a too grisly for cable list, movies that they would not show, that they considered too horrendous. And one of them was the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That movie was banned from cable for, I don't know, something like 26 years.
Wow.
I mean, it was not until they announced the remake that finally people gave up their fight against the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. For years, it was the favorite example of a congressman if he was going to talk about, depraved media in America.
Yeah.
Stuff like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
And that's because it was one of the greatest titles of all
true.
time.
That's very true, yeah. I mean, that's on TV all the time now.
Oh, I know. If you're familiar with the Italian movie Demons, that one was considered too intense for premium cable. You had even though they were showing Total Recall every week, Total Recall has something like 350 on-screen killings in it.
Wow.
Anyway, so then I go over to TNT, and the Turner networks at the time were very family-oriented. They're based in Atlanta, and they had an extensive list of rules and things you couldn't say and things you couldn't do on TV. I had to stop smoking the cigars on TV. They weren't going to let me drink beer on TV either, until I pointed out that they had a lot of beer sponsors for the NASCAR franchise, and they kind of like lightened up on the beer. But the most interesting thing is there are things they didn't want me to say, so I would invent nonsense words, to cover, it's just funny words to say whatever I want to say, aardvarking and wangdoodle and so the words that I made up would start showing up on the official list of forbidden words. And I was like, you can't do this. They're not real words. How can you put these on the list?
Wow.
And they were especially upset because I was talking one week about, I was calling these people slopeheads. And they put that on the list and said, you can't call people slopeheads. That's a derogatory term. And I said, who? I said, I didn't know it was derogatory. Who was I?
Yeah. Who are you offending?
Making fun of?
Right.
And they said, that's an Asian derogatory term. And I said, no, it's slant eye is the derogatory Asian term, not slope head.
Right.
You're confusing the words because they start with SL, you know. Nevertheless, they stood their ground, said no more slope head references
Wow.
on our TV network.
Wow.
So, but in general, they didn't really watch the show or notice the show because we were on so late at night and we came on at different times and it was on the weekend and I had to be careful because if I ever made a presentation for the sales force or something, I might show them something that they didn't know was on their own network. And so we were kind of a stealth show, you know.
Yeah.
We came on about 11 o'clock, and we could just go as late as we wanted to because they didn't care when we finished.
Yeah, I heard that your show could kind of just go until like the next block of TV started at like 6 a.m. That's incredible.
6 a.m. We just had to be out by 6 a.m. So we could finish at 4:30. We could finish at 3:30. We occasionally did all night marathons. You know, where we would be out right at 6 a.m.
Wow.
If we finished early, they would just fill in with short form programming.
Right.
You know, freedom is what allowed me to just like go on and on about it.
And I mean,
about the film.
It's what made the show so great is that it did feel so live and it was a very spontaneous, free flow type of feel that you just don't get on TV. TV has changed so much.
No, I don't think that will ever come back. I mean, it's remarkable that even in the late 90s you could still do that, and I attribute that to one man, Ted Turner. I mean, Ted Turner kind of. It's not that he made that policy or he had anything directly to do with the show, but there was a sense of freedom at the network simply because he was the renegade guy in the TV business.
Yeah.
And you weren't under all the kind of restrictions you would have been at one of the major New York networks,
right.
You know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I love that just that freeness that you had over there, and it is a shame. I mean, you have certain, late night hosts that still present horror movies, but it feels very scripted. It was nothing like the shows that you did, and another thing I want to say about the shows that you did is that you could see that you really cared about those movies, like whereas a lot of other hosts, maybe I won't name names, but kind of almost air them just to goof on them. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, there've always been the two strands of late night hosting. The original late night horror host was Vampira in L.A. and Vampira was just a model. She was a Vegas showgirl, and she just made wisecracks. And I don't think she ever watched a single movie that she was involved with. You know,
yeah.
It was just eye candy around the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other founder of late night hosting is John Zackerly, who was at a local TV station in Philadelphia and kind of invented incorporating the commentary into the movie that you're watching. He would even go so far as to cut himself into the scenes of the movie. And he played sort of a lame version of Dracula, intentionally lame version of Dracula, and did comedy, but he incorporated it into the film. My philosophy was we should be celebrating the films, no matter how bad they were, and we occasionally did have some real stinkers. There's a way to enjoy it, we'll find that way.
Yep.
I was not a big fan of the hosting where it's basically just stunts and sketches, where you're just you're doing a little comedy bit at the commercial breaks. There's no other connection to the movie.
Exactly.
And So yeah, it was a place to. I love it when people come up to me and say, "You made me appreciate those movies." I say, I'm working in special effects now. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. Because I never heard anybody that like really appreciated how the movies were made, and I love it when people say that. So
yeah, absolutely.
That was much of the fun, and we didn't have resources to find out how the movies were made. We didn't have the extensive resources that people have today.
Yeah, that's what made it all the more impressive, I think, is when you would give the drive-in total, how many breasts were exposed or how many car crashes or demonic possessions, whatever it was like you can't look that stuff up on the internet back when you were doing that show.
Right, and we couldn't even sometimes identify who the real director was of the movie because, for example, we showed a lot of Italian horror. Well, when those Italian horror films were originally made, they tried to disguise them so they look like American films. In Italy, they're the best in the world at dubbing, and so they can dub those European actors where you can't really tell that they're European. And they would do things like they always put a box of Kellogg's cornflakes on the kitchen table, just as an indicator. This is America. It's really America. Yeah. I know it might seem a little off in your subconscious, but it's America, Yeah. And so all the Italian directors had fake English names. Some of them had 12, 15 fake English names.
Wow.
We didn't know what their real name was. We knew that the name they put on the movie was Suspect. But we had to sort of like we were flying blind as far as finding people who could tell us exactly who made the film, and in some cases who was in the film, because actors would try to disguise themselves as well. It was not considered a reputable business.
Yeah, that's true. Now you mentioned marathons, how you would do some marathons. You did, I think, Friday the 13th marathon. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but did you guys not show part 4 in that?
Well, I think you're right. First of all, we only had a certain number of hours where we could get them all in. And we did leave one out, and I can't remember whether it was 3 or 4. Yeah. It was probably one that we temporarily didn't have the license for, or some other reason. But yeah, we weren't able to show. I think at the time, I want to say there were 5. Maybe there were I think there were 5 at the time, or 5 that were available to us. Yeah. And so we probably showed 1, 2, 3, and 5. Yeah,
I was just wondering, like, maybe there was a reason you guys didn't show 4, but it was probably just...
I'm sure it was some mundane reason, some legal reason. Yeah.
I gotcha. You had a lot of guests on both shows, Drive-In Theater and MonsterVision. One that I remember very well, and with the recent passing of George Romero, you had a reunion of Night of the Living Dead. A lot of the cast, Judith O'Dea, and that was really great. And what was interesting about it was now, like I said, with George Romero passing away recently, a lot of talk has been about, was Night of the Living Dead about racism? Was that there an underlying thing there? But what was kind of interesting when you watched the footage of the reunion on your show was that they were saying, no, not really. It was just that he auditioned for the part and got it. It wasn't because he was black necessarily.
Right. They said he was the best actor. He was a New York method actor who came down for the audition, and he was just the best guy. They didn't have any anti-racist subtext. I mean, in retrospect, it was a stroke of luck. It makes the movie that much better to have a black protagonist. But it's George Romero for years said, no, we weren't trying to make any racial statement. We weren't trying to make any racial statement. And then at some point he changed, and he said, "Yeah, we were." But all the people who worked on the movie said, and those actors who worked on the movie, they weren't just actors. They were also on the crew, and some of them were creative partner. Carl Hardman was a creative partner.
Yeah.
So they knew what was going on, and they said, no, there wasn't any.
Yeah.
It was about, up until that time, up until 1967, if you count the zombie movies, there'd been like 5. From the from the 30s to the 60s, there were like 5 zombie movies.
Yeah.
So the thing that made the movie unique was, it was the first full-scale zombie apocalypse movie.
Right.
It started a whole genre. That's what makes the movie unique, and the fact that in keeping with the times, they never explained what created the zombies. That was a common thing in the 60s. You didn't feel the necessity to give logical reasons for for things like that. So people interpreted it as a communist takeover. They had their various theories about what it was really about.
Yeah.
When you go like 20 years later, John Carpenter makes They Live, and it's so on the nose, you know exactly what it's about. It's an anti-Reagan, screed,
Uh-huh.
Night of the Living Dead was just an extremely well-produced movie by a guy whose career had prepared him for that in the commercial film industry of Pittsburgh.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me ask you about sort of like how we were talking about, these movies may not have been accepted so much in the mainstream and things like that. And even actors who were at the time, maybe earlier in their career, having success in other genres and things. Then as their career starts getting on a downturn, a lot of them use horror movies, it seems, to kind of give it a boost. And they start starring in these movies that they once said negative things about. I mean, there's a few examples of that.
Yeah, it's kind of like minor league baseball. The people that participate are either on their way up or on their way out.
Yeah.
And there's nobody in their prime that wants to be exclusively associated with horror movies. So you have 2 or 3 really fine performances by Jack Nicholson in early Roger Corman movies. Yeah. There are many actors, who became, and directors who became Oscar winners in later years who started out in Roger Corman films. And Roger Corman would also hire, when you see an actor who has a name turning up in a Roger Corman film after he has a name, it's usually because he's just out of rehab. And that's because if you've had an alcohol problem or a drug problem, you can't get insurance. The bond company that insures the film, they won't insure it if you're going to use that actor. So you don't have as many choices until you prove yourself in 2 or 3 films,
Yeah.
So Roger would say, well, I'll just, hire somebody to watch him 24 hours a day. And, and we'll use him and we'll get all the scenes in one day. So we're not at risk,
Yeah.
And, so usually when you see somebody famous in one of these exploitation films, it's because they ran into some kind of problem, in their career,
Yeah.
in Hollywood. I mean, I'll tell this one because he told him that he wasn't ashamed of it. But Dennis Hopper was in rehab for years. He just disappeared in the early 80s and didn't get hired. He came out of rehab, and the first movie he made was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2.
Uh-huh.
And his agents begged him not to do it. And he basically wanted to do it because it was being filmed in Austin, which was one of his favorite places. And it was being filmed in the summer, so he could hang out with Willie Nelson at Willie Nelson's 4th of July picnic. Willie Nelson was a big friend of him, fellow hippies, two hippies. Yeah. And it actually worked because he was clean the whole movie. And as a result of that, David Lynch agreed to use him in Blue Velvet. Mm-hmm. And once he made Blue Velvet, then it was on. Yeah. Oh, Dennis Hopper is back, and look at how weird he can be. Let's use him in this, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. That's true. I heard you were on. In fact, you were in Texas Chainsaw Part 2. Some of your scenes were cut.
Well, the thing was, I went down there to write an article about for Rolling Stone about Dennis Hopper, and while I was there, Toby Hooper, the director, said, "Oh, you're that guy that writes all the good stuff about, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Oh, that's great." He says, "Over here with Kit Carson, the screenwriter. You guys write a script, write a scene for you. I want to put you in the movie." and so we wrote a couple of scenes really quickly. And when it was time for the movie to come out, the movie was long. And they took the scenes out. Well, they should have taken the scenes out. I mean, it's like it was just something thrown into the movie at the last minute. It made no sense for it to be in the movie. So Canon Films was exactly right when they excised those scenes from the movie. There was a big part of that movie that was the party atmosphere in Dallas on the Texas-Oklahoma weekend, and that's where the killer is going around. Leatherface is killing the partying students. Uh-huh. And most of that came out either because they didn't film it right or for some other reason. It was a kind of a troubled movie. Yeah. And so, so my scenes didn't fit with it anyway, and they did restore them. There was a couple of, I think they put them as DVD extras on one of the releases. But
well, speaking of movies that you have been in and they kept the scenes in, I mean, one very famous movie, Casino. How was that experience? That was awesome.
Well, that was great. I mean, I was. There was about a 6-month lag between when I was on the movie channel and when I was on TNT. Uh-huh. And so I was auditioning for roles, and I really just thought it would be, once in a lifetime experience to audition for Martin Scorsese, and meet Martin Scorsese. It was like a huge deal to me. Yeah. And when I got the part, it was like even more amazing. I kind of felt like I had the part after I did the audition, and he said, "So, what's the best women in prison movie?" And I thought, "Oh my God, he watches the show."
That's awesome.
And we talked about women in prison movies because he's not just an expert on, American film, French film, Russian film, Yugoslavian film. He's an expert on exploitation films as well. Yeah. He's another guy. Well, first film, Roger Corman. Wow. Roger Corman film. Yeah.
So how was it working? I mean, with De Niro and
really easy because those guys had their little club, that they've worked together for years, I guess, and they have a way of working, and all you have to do is to say yes, sir, whenever they say anything, and work the way they do, yeah. Because it was interesting. Martin Scorsese likes overlapping dialogue. He likes you to talk on top of each other,
Yeah.
Get that that energy. And so he has everybody come into his trailer before the scene is shot, and just run the scene over and over and over again 3 or 4 times. And then when he likes something that he hears, he says, "Stop! That's it. Lock it in right there. Do that." And so it's a little bit of improv, because in the course of doing that, they change the script. You know, there's things that you were going to say that you don't say. There's things that you add that you weren't in the script. You know.
Yeah.
So, and he always says, you know, not about the scripts, not about the scripts, not about the script. What's underneath? You know. And so, so that was fun, and it was, you know, they're slow on those big budget movies. They're really slow.
Oh yeah.
And so you sit around a lot, and you have to make conversation with these giant movie stars, you know. And it's like, how do you do that? And my scenes were with Robert De Niro, and I was like, and he's not a talkative guy. He's not a chatty guy, you know. And so I spent a lot of my time like, you know, what can I say to him that's not stupid?
Yeah, right.
But it was a fun experience, and the late great Don Rickles was in the cast, and he was there, and he would make just as many jokes in his private life as he does on stage. Right. He was just like on all the time. Yeah,
it's a great movie, and it's great seeing you in it. So let me ask you this real quick about. There seems to be a revival of VHS these days. I mean, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure why. I like DVDs and Blu-ray. I mean, you get better prints of the films, and you get commentaries, as you've done a lot of DVD commentaries and things. And that's really I enjoy that stuff a lot. So I'm not sure of why this VHS revival's kind of going on. You got any thoughts on that?
You're right. There is a VHS revival, and I noticed it. Probably like 3 years ago, it was really well underway, and there was a brisk market for VHSs on Craigslist and other places online. And occasionally I do go to the horror conventions or the film conventions of various kinds, and there are retailers who just sell the VHS tapes, and all I can say is people will walk by, they'll see the huge inventory of the VHS tapes, and they will just go into super nostalgia mode.
Yeah.
They go, "Oh my God," and they'll go right to the one that they used to own. Yeah. And then they'll hold it in their hands, and they'll look at it and say, "Oh my God." And I'll say, do you have a player? Do you have something you can play that on? And they say, "Oh yeah, I do. Does it work? Is it in working order? If it breaks, is there somebody that can fix it?" You know?
Yeah.
But it's a nostalgia thing. It's a little bit of a feeling that the image is warmer. The image on the VHS is a warmer. Yeah, I think it's illusory. I don't think it's true.
Uh-huh.
But they get a warm and fuzzy feeling of rewinding and watching it that way.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's similar to vinyl in music.
Right.
You know. Although I think the quality of vinyl is much better than the quality of VHS.
Yeah.
I mean, VHS tends to fade badly and become fuzzier as years go on. So, and they aren't making any new ones, so you're buying the old ones.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, that's a trend. I don't think it's a millennial trend. I think it's an older person trend.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess it begs the question: what kind of movie setup do you have at your house?
I have. I still have I occasionally use a DVD player, but increasingly I just use streaming like everybody else.
Yeah.
My family in Arkansas still goes to the Walmart and buys the DVDs.
All right.
There still is a thriving DVD marketplace, and I think that will always be with us. I don't think DVDs will ever totally go away, because people like to own what they love.
Right.
And streaming, there's a point at which you feel like you don't really own that, even if you downloaded it. So they like to have the physical object, and I think there'll always be some kind of market for that.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't want to hold you too long, so I just want to cover a couple more things before I let you go here. This is Joe Bob Briggs I'm talking to here on the RockStop. So let me ask you this about remakes. A lot of movies, a lot of classics are being remade, and I just saw today, for example, they're remaking Death Wish with Bruce Willis. So what are your thoughts on remakes?
Well, I'm kind of an old fart as far as that goes. It's like, if the movie is a classic like Death Wish, it's almost like, remake a movie that was not a success and make it good. Charles Bronson, when he made Death Wish, was probably pushing, I'm going to say, somebody will correct me immediately because they're looking it up right now in IMDb, but he was probably in his late 40s, maybe his early 50s. He wasn't young.
No. Yeah.
So Bruce Willis is the correct casting choice if you're going to try to duplicate the magic of Death Wish. However, I don't think it's the time to be making Death Wish. I think you go against the prevailing cultural trends. You make the movie. You make Billy Jack. That's what they should remake. You remake an early '70s movie. Remake Billy Jack. Kick ass for peace.
Right.
Right. But they'll probably do okay with that because it has the great title. It has. I would be more upset if they remade Dirty Harry, because I don't think you can ever match the performance of Clint Eastwood,
right,
or the performance of Andrew. I can't remember his name, but the villain in Dirty Harry, the Psycho.
Right. I know, and this new remake, of course, is set in Chicago, where it's a murder capital. It just seems to be really bad lately. So to see it, I see your point. It's like it's too real, I think, right now.
Yeah, it's too on the nose. It's like when the Republicans are in power, you have to make Democratic movies, and vice versa. So Death Wish is a reaction to the presidential campaign of George McGovern, most liberal guy to ever run for president. Yeah. And so, and sort of the idea that we'd lost control of our cities through various liberal policies.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
I'm not. Even the remakes that are well done, I'm not a big fan of them. Even the ones that are supervised by the very people who made the original, are usually don't perform. The Evil Dead remake being an example. It was okay, but it wasn't. It just didn't have that special oomph. Like write an original movie. Take a risk.
I completely agree with you on that. It's very few times that it works. So
I'll tell you an exploitation movie that has a political subtext that's really great this year. Get Out. Get Out. If you've seen Get Out, boy, that came out at just the right time. I assume enough people in your audience have seen it. If you haven't seen it, I won't give it away. But that's an example of sort of a pure exploitation movie that but made for 2017.
Right.
Made with a 2017 point of view.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about they did a documentary. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm planning on it very soon, about the Tippi Hedren movie Roar, 1981, and you were interviewed in that and talked about the whole production.
Well, they just they made a documentary on the making of Roar for Animal Planet.
Yeah,
and then Animal Planet sort of sat on it for a year and then released it in the summer, and I think we didn't know what to do with it. But Roar was the most dangerous movie ever made. When it was re-released last year, they had a great poster. It said, "No animals were harmed during the making of this movie. However, 80 crew members were."
Yeah.
And it was this wild idea of Tippi Hedren and her husband to work in close proximity with wild lions, tigers, elephants. I think there may be a cheetah in there. People were almost killed, and people were horribly maimed. Melanie Griffith got hurt bad. So it's a one of a kind movie because you watch it, and you're not that taken in by the plot, but you're constantly on edge because you feel like at any moment any actor in this film could die.
Right. Yeah.
So it's just the most nerve-wracking thing to watch.
I mean, I've seen clips of it. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm definitely planning on it. And from what I've seen, it looks, I mean, like you said, you're on edge the whole time. So many movies these days use CG, and you really have no feel for those characters at all because, you know nothing is going on. But with that movie, I could see why they call it the most dangerous movie. Yeah,
it's now the good result of it is that in order to make sure that the animals were taken care of, Tippi Hedren opened her big game ranch in Southern California, which exists to this day, where she rescues exotic animals and makes sure they're not abused, and that's been going on ever since then. That was sort of like the good ending to the really bad idea.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So I'll just kind of wrap it up with this question about film soundtracks. I mean, of course, they are very important, like whether we're talking movie scores or just, soundtracks with just bands contributing. What are your opinions on, like, some of the better ones?
Well, of course, the first guy that comes to mind is John Carpenter, who wrote all the music for all of his movies.
Yeah.
And has very, very iconic horror themes. And then probably the most famous exploitation soundtrack is the soundtrack for Psycho because of the violins in the kill scene. Mm-hmm. That was Bernard Herrmann. More than any other genre, horror depends on a soundtrack.
Yeah,
it's almost more important than camera work. There are, but the greatest soundtracks are the soundtracks you don't remember because they're so effortlessly integrated into the action of the movie.
Yeah.
I've actually hosted a couple of concerts with symphony orchestras where the composer's there, and like the guy who wrote Ice Pirates. I don't know if you ever saw Ice Pirates, but it's a great soundtrack. But inevitably, the orchestra experience of listening to the music in a concert hall as opposed to seeing it, it's always somewhat disappointing, because the thing that makes the music powerful is that interplay between the image and the sound. Yeah. And so that's why many symphonies now, like the New York Philharmonic, they do shows where they show the Godfather, and the symphony plays the music for the Godfather. You know, while you watch the movie. I think they did it with Star Wars. You know, that's a big thing now around the country, so symphonies can make money and not go out of business.
Yeah, right.
But a lot of these low budget filmmakers use bands, and the band, in exchange for getting their music exposed to the public, would often turn over publishing rights, and Roger Corman made a small fortune on publishing rights for bands that he used in movies like Rock and Roll High School and some of his biker movies, and but that's always a very important element, especially in action films. Ron Howard's first movie was a movie for Roger Corman called Eat My Dust. It was a car chase movie set in the South. And it has that sort of what would you call it, Bonnie and Clyde fast music, you know, to it.
Right. And let me just, because this just came to mind, let me just ask you this. So many horror movie franchises. Which one would you consider like one of the top ones? I mean, you know, you've of course got Friday 13th, Psycho, Child's Play, so many franchises. Even the Death Wish we were just talking about had like 5 movies. Which one do you think had like the most amount of, you know, really fine movies?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is James Bond. I mean, that's those are big budget movies, but that's boy, I mean, they ran out of Ian Fleming novels 2 or 3 decades ago and started using Ian Fleming short stories and then Ian Fleming grocery lists and then, you know, Ian Fleming emails. You know, I don't know what they used to get the plots of those movies, but talk about sustaining a franchise and sustaining it through many, many different actors. They've managed to do that. As far as in the exploitation field, I know the worst one. The worst one is the Howling franchise. They made one movie, and then they tried 8 more times. The Howling 7 is probably the worst movie ever made. However, it's very entertaining because it was shot in Pioneer Town, California, at the old Western Ranch there, and it's just so bad that it's funny. Right. Consistently funny. Successful franchises. I would say the Evil Dead trilogy is a successful franchise. Usually, franchises don't survive the follow-up, the sequel. Yeah. And so that would be the case, I think, with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The second one underperformed, even though it's a cult movie today. But most horror movies can't be repeated.
That's true. That's very true. Well, all right, man. I really appreciate you calling in. I could talk to you all day about this stuff. This is Joe Bob Briggs, and it was really an honor talking to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
All right, man. Take care.